The year was 1887, and the afternoon sun over western New Mexico was the color of a fresh wound. It bled across the sky, staining the clouds and baking the dust that swirled through the town of Dusty Spur. The wind had a mean streak, a dry, hot breath that tasted of grit and distance. It carried the lonesome shriek of a cattle train and the scent of the shabby saloon on the main street, a smell of stale beer, sweat, and cheap regret. The street itself was a pocked and rutted testament to the horse, a messy map of comings and goings. Abigail Hart stepped down from the passenger car, her hand gripping the handle of a heavy wooden chest. In her other hand, she clutched a packet of letters, their edges softened from countless readings. At 25, her face still held the hopeful cast of youth, though it was now layered with the grime of a 3-day journey and etched with lines of fatigue. The promises in those letters, penned in her husband Edwin's looping, confident script, had been her compass, guiding her west to this splinter of a town. They were going to build a life here, a ranch nestled in a valley he had found, a place where the grass grew thick and the water ran clear, a home. That was her one and only goal, find her husband and begin. She scanned the dusty platform, her eyes searching for Edwin's familiar, handsome face. He was not there. A prickle of unease, small and sharp, worked its way through her exhaustion. She told herself the train was early, or that he was held up with business. He was a man of enterprise, after all. That was his word for it. She wrestled the chest toward the station house, its small porch offering a sliver of shade. The station master, a man whose face seemed to be melting slowly into his collar, looked up from his telegraph key. "Looking for someone, Mrs.?" he asked, his voice a dry rustle. "My husband," Abigail said, forcing a brightness she did not feel. "Edwin Hart. He was to meet me. Did he leave a message?" The man's gaze flickered, a momentary shift that spoke volumes. He chewed on the inside of his cheek. "Hart, you say? Can't say I've seen him today, or yesterday." He paused, then seemed to take pity on the earnest hope in her eyes. "Might be you should ask over at the saloon. Pike's Saloon. Edwin spent a good deal of time there." The words pent hung in the air, heavy and unpleasant. Abigail thanked the man, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. With a deep breath, she left the chest on the porch and crossed the street, her good traveling shoes sinking into the churned dust. Pike's Saloon was even dimmer and more odorous inside than it had been from the street. A few men hunched over their glasses at the bar, their face lost in shadow. A large man stood behind the bar, wiping a glass with a rag that had seen better decades. He was broad in the shoulder and thick in the gut, with a face like a slab of raw meat and small, shrewd eyes that missed nothing. "I am looking for a man named Silas Pike," Abigail said, her voice sounding small in the cavernous silence. The man's lips stretched into something that was not quite a smile. "You found him. What can I do for you?" "It is about my husband, Edwin Hart," the station master said. Silas Pike let out a short, humorless laugh. He set the glass down with a thud. "Edwin Hart. Yes, I know him. Knew him, I should say. He's gone." "Gone," Abigail repeated, the word catching in her throat. "Gone where on business?" "You could call it that," Pike said, his eyes gleaming with a greasy sort of pleasure. "The business of saving his own hide. Lit out for Mexico 3 nights ago. Left in a hurry." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Abigail's feet. "Mexico, but our ranch. The money I sent him." Pike's smile widened, showing yellowed teeth. "Ah, the money. That's the thing about money, Mrs. It has a way of changing hands, especially at a poker table." He reached under the bar and pulled out a slip of paper, smoothing it on the worn wood. "Your husband, it turns out, was a terrible poker player, but a very enthusiastic one." He pushed the paper toward her. It was an IOU, a promissory note. The amount scribbled on it made her gasp. It was everything, every last cent she had sent, the savings from her dowry, The money meant to buy livestock and lumber and a future. Edwin's signature was a desperate scrawl at the bottom. "He signed over everything," Pike said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Even the contents of that fancy chest you brought. Collateral, you see." "A man like your husband always believes his luck is about to turn." The air left Abigail's lungs in a rush. Penniless. He had left her utterly penniless, in a town she did not know, under a sky that felt vast and cruel. The letters in her hand suddenly felt like a fool's treasure. Pages of lies and empty dreams. The betrayal was a physical blow, knocking the strength from her knees. She gripped the edge of the bar to steady herself. I do not understand," she whispered. "It is simple enough," Pike said, his voice hardening. The veneer of civility fell away, revealing the predator beneath. He ran. "You are here, and the debt remains." She stumbled back out into the punishing sunlight, blind and deaf to the world around her. The saloon door swung shut, cutting off Pike's satisfied chuckle. She made her way back to the station platform on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Her chest, the one she had so carefully packed with the linens and silver and memories of a life that was supposed to be, now seemed like a tombstone. Her purse, it was not much, just a few dollars for necessities, but it was all she had left in the world. As her mind reeled, a scrawny youth with darting eyes saw his chance. He bumped against her, his hand a flicker of motion, and in a heartbeat her reticule was gone. He was 10 feet away before she even realized what had happened. "Hey!" she cried out, but her voice was a weak croak. The thief took off, dodging a stack of crates. He was not running fast, more of a cocky trot, confident in his escape. He did not count on the man leaning against the station wall, a man who seemed to have been carved from the very dust and sun of the territory. He was a lone cowboy, lean and quiet, with a face weathered by the elements. His hat was pulled low, but not low enough to hide the startling blue of his eyes, the color of a summer sky faded by years of relentless sun. He moved with an economy of motion that was almost lazy, yet deeply purposeful. He did not shout or draw a weapon. He simply lifted his foot, worked his boot off, and with a flick of his wrist, sent a thick woolen sock sailing through the air. The sock, weighted with what sounded like a few loose coins or perhaps a small rock, spun like a bolus and wrapped itself neatly around the thief's ankles. The youth went down in a surprised heap, the purse flying from his grasp. The cowboy ambled over, retrieved the purse, and then nudged the tangled thief with the toe of his remaining boot. "Seems you dropped this," he said, his voice a low, calm drawl. He then looked at the sputtering thief on the ground. "And you, son, need to work on your footing." He walked back to Abigail and handed her the purse. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of mild amusement and something else, something quieter and more observant. He looked at her tear-streaked, dust-caked face, at the desperation in her eyes, and then at the imposing saloon across the street. He seemed to put the pieces together without her having to say a word. "The West sells sunshine by the pound. Ma'am," he said, his lips twitching just slightly. "Looks like you bought the win by mistake." Abigail could only stare at him, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in her throat, caught somewhere between a sob and a gasp. A man had just saved her last few dollars by hitting a thief with his laundry. The absurdity of it was a small, bright spark in the overwhelming darkness. "Thank you," she managed to say. "My name is Eli Boone," the cowboy offered, pulling his boot back on. Before she could introduce herself, a shadow fell over them. Silas Pike had emerged from his saloon, drawn by the commotion. He loomed over them, his bulk blocking the sun. His eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. Eli Boone standing beside the well-dressed but clearly distraught woman. "Boone," Pike grunted, a note of displeasure in his voice. "Always turning up where you are not wanted." His gaze shifted to Abigail, and his smile returned, sharp and predatory. "And Mrs. Hart, I am glad I caught you. We have business to discuss." He held up the IOU again, waving it like a flag of conquest. "Your husband has made you a debtor in this town, and I am a man who always collects." Eli Boone stood straighter, his quiet demeanor hardening into something more solid, more unmovable. "The ladies had a long journey. Pike, whatever business you have can wait. This is not your concern." "Cowboy," Pike sneered. He took a step closer to Abigail, his presence suffocating. "There is a simple solution. My cattle camp is always in need of a cook, a woman's work. You can work off what your husband owes, every last penny." He thrust the paper toward her. "A husband's debt is a wife's debt. That is the law out here." Abigail recoiled. The thought of being in this man's power, trapped in a remote camp of rough men, was a terror colder than any she had ever known. The IOU felt like a shackle, its legality uncertain, but its threat entirely real. "That paper is not worth the ink on it, and you know it," Eli said, his voice still low, but now with an edge of steel. "Is that so?" Pike challenged, his hand inching toward the pistol on his hip. "Are you a lawyer now, Boone, or just a stray with a big mouth?" Eli did not flinch. He simply met Pike's glare with his own steady, sun-faded gaze. "I am just a man who knows a bully when he sees one. Now back away from the lady." For a long moment, the air crackled with tension. The town seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a final, contemptuous sneer, Pike lowered his hand. He was not afraid of Eli, but a public fight was messy. There were other ways. "You have 1 month, Mrs. Hart," he spat. 30 days to pay. After that, everything you own, including that chest, belongs to me, and so will your time." He turned and lumbered back toward his saloon, a monument to greed and petty power. The silence he left behind was profound. Abigail was trembling, her resolve completely shattered. She was alone, trapped, and saw no way out. Eli Boone broke the silence. "He can't do that," he said, more to himself than to her, "not legally." He looked at her, his gaze gentle now. "You cannot stay here on the platform. There is a boarding house, run by the widow O'Rourke. It is clean and safe. I can take you there. You can find some work, maybe at the post office or helping at the church, until you get your bearings." It was not a promise of salvation, but an offer of a foothold, a chance to breathe, a simple act of decency in a world that had suddenly become indecent. Abigail looked at this quiet stranger who had asked for nothing, who had defended her with a sock and then with his steady nerve, and she felt the first flicker of something other than despair. She nodded, unable to speak. He picked up one end of her heavy wooden chest. "Let us get you settled then, ma'am." Later that evening, in a small, spare room at the back of the widow O'Rourke's boarding house, the reality of her situation settled upon Abigail like a shroud. The room contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair. Her magnificent chest, filled with the artifacts of her former life, looked absurdly out of place. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid. The scent of cedar and lavender rose to meet her. There were the embroidered linens her mother had given her, the small set of silver spoons from her grandmother, the books she had loved, and tucked carefully in a layer of tissue. Her wedding veil. It was simple, made of fine, delicate tulle, a cloud of white that had represented all her hopes for the future. She lifted it out. The fine material felt impossibly fragile in her calloused, trembling fingers. The wind that blew through Dusty Spur, the same wind that seemed to want to strip everything down to the bone, felt as though it could tear this veil to shreds. It was a ghost of a promise, a symbol of a dream that had been ripped away by the casual cruelty of a man she had loved. She clutched it to her chest, the tears she had held back all day finally coming, silent and hot. The veil was all she had left of that dream, a thin, tattered thread of hope in the vast, unforgiving wilderness, and for now, she would hold on. The first lesson of the Dry Bone Valley was water. It was a lesson taught not in a schoolhouse, but at the town well. a stone-lined hole in the earth that served as the community's heart and its primary source of gossip. In Abigail's former life, water was a simple matter of turning a handle on a pump. Here, it was a currency earned through aching muscles and raw, blistered hands. The rope was coarse, the wooden bucket heavy and prone to swinging wildly, sloshing precious cupfuls back into the depths. Each trip left her palms screaming, her back a column of fire. She felt the eyes of the town on her, the whispers that followed her like the dust devils dancing on the edge of town. The abandoned wife, a gold digger who had come up empty. One afternoon, as she struggled to haul the bucket over the stone lip of the well, the handle gave a sickening crack. The bucket plunged, the rope burning through her torn hands as it followed. A wave of despair washed over her, so potent it nearly buckled her knees. A quiet voice spoke from behind her. "Looks like that handle has seen better days." It was Eli Boone. He moved with that same unhurried grace she remembered, stepping forward to peer into the well. He said nothing about her red, weeping blisters, though she knew he saw them. Instead, he fetched a length of baling wire and some tools from his saddlebag. With deft, patient movements, he fished the rope out, reattached the bucket, and bound the splintered handle with the wire, making it stronger than it had been before. "You are pulling too fast," he said, his eyes on his work. "Let the weight of the bucket do the work on the way down. On the way up, find a rhythm. A slow, steady pull is better than a fast one that wears you out." He gestured to the sky, to the thin, wispy clouds gathering at the horizon. "See those mares' tails? Means wind is coming. Maybe rain in a day or two. When you get your water, let the bucket sit in the shade for a spell before you carry it. Keeps it from evaporating on the walk back." His advice was practical, delivered without a hint of pity. It was a gift of knowledge, more valuable than coin in this unforgiving place. She thanked him, her voice thick with an emotion she could not name. The whispers did not stop. When she went to Millie's Mercantile for a small sack of flour and some beans, the stout, no-nonsense proprietress eyed her worn purse. "Payment first," Millie stated, not unkindly, but with the firm finality of a business ledger. Reverend Abel, a gentleman with kind eyes, stopped her outside the church and spoke of faith and perseverance, but his words could not fill an empty stomach. The town watched her, waiting to see if she would break, if she would crumble under the weight of her husband's sins. A few days after her arrival, she received an unexpected visitor at the boarding house. Sheriff May Collins was a woman who seemed to have been forged rather than born, with a spine of iron and a gaze that cut through pretense. She was not large, but she carried an authority that made her seem to fill the small room. "Mrs. Hart," she began, her voice as crisp as a new dollar bill. "I have paid a visit to Silas Pike. I informed him that any form of harassment or intimidation directed at you will result in his immediate and prolonged incarceration." She paused, letting the words sink in. He was not pleased. "I also told him I would be looking into the legality of that IOU he is so proud of. The law is a tricky thing out here, but it is not entirely on the side of bullies." The sheriff's visit was a balm to Abigail's frayed nerves. It was the first time since she had arrived that she felt she had an ally, someone with the power to stand against the shadow Pike cast over the town. Sheriff Collins promised nothing, but her quiet determination was a shield. Eli's suggestion of work proved fruitful. The postmaster, a harried man overwhelmed by the paperwork that followed the Wells Fargo stagecoach, hired her to copy shipping manifests and ledgers. The pay was a pittance, barely enough to cover her board and a little food. But the work was a blessing. The neat columns of figures, the precise looping of her pen. It was a small, orderly world she could control, a refuge from the chaos of her life. She would sit for hours, her fingers growing cramped and ink-stained. And for those hours, she was not the abandoned wife. She was a clerk, earning her own way. Meanwhile, Eli Boone made a trade. He spent a week helping a local rancher round up stray cattle, taking no pay. Instead, He took the rancher's lame mare, a fine-looking horse with a slight, permanent limp in her foreleg that made her useless for hard range work. The town saw it as a fool's bargain. Abigail saw it as an act of kindness, a man giving a second chance to a creature others had written off. One afternoon, a westbound train hissed to a stop at the station, taking on water. Abigail was on her way back from the post office when she saw a familiar face through the window of a passenger car. It was a woman she had known from back east, the wife of a banker. A woman whose life was a tapestry of tea parties and social calls. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. Abigail saw the flicker of recognition in the woman's eyes, followed by a look of pity and confusion. In that moment, a wave of shame so hot and powerful it made her dizzy washed over her. She turned away quickly, her face burning, and hurried back to the boarding house. The chasm between the woman she had been and the woman she was now had never felt so vast. She was haunted by the thought that she had been a fool, that her trust and love had been a weakness Edwin had exploited. That evening, Eli found her on the boarding house porch, staring out at the darkening landscape. He had the mare with him, gently brushing her coat. "That is a fine-looking animal," Abigail said, for lack of anything better to say. "She has a good heart," Eli replied, not looking up. "Just needs to be shown she is worth something." He finished his grooming and turned to her. "I came to teach you something important." He led her around back to the small fire pit used for cooking. He produced a pot and a bag of beans. "Cooking beans," he said with the utmost seriousness. "If you soak them, then cook them slow with the lid on tight. The pressure builds, makes for a tender bean, but you have to be careful." He demonstrated how to leave the lid slightly ajar, braced with a small pebble. Otherwise, you risk an explosion. The lesson was so mundane, so domestic, it felt almost comical coming from this quiet, capable cowboy. But she listened, grateful for the distraction. The next day, she decided to try it herself. She was stirring the pot, the comforting smell of cooking beans filling the small yard, when Silas Pike appeared. He loomed over her, his presence fouling the air. "Your time is running out. Mrs. Hart," he sneered. 20 days left. I trust you are saving your pennies." Abigail ignored him, her heart pounding. She refused to give him the satisfaction of her fear. She focused on the pot, on the gentle bubbling within. She had forgotten the pebble. With a loud bang that made them both jump, the pot lid shot into the air like a discus, spun, and caught Silas Pike squarely on the side of his head. It was not a hard blow, more of a glancing, metallic clang, but the surprise of it sent the big man stumbling backward. He let out a yelp of outrage, one hand flying to his head, the other pointing a trembling finger at her. You assaulted me," he sputtered. Beans and hot water were splattered across the front of his vest. For a moment, Abigail was too shocked to move. Then, seeing the look of pure, undignified astonishment on his face, she could not help it. A laugh escaped her, a real, genuine laugh, the first she had uttered in weeks. It felt like a release, a small, defiant victory. Pike, red-faced and furious, could only glower before turning and stomping away, muttering threats under his breath. Later that week, Sheriff Collins found her at the post office. She held a folded piece of paper in her hand. "I got a copy of your marriage registration sent over from the county seat back east," the sheriff said, her expression grimly satisfied. "It has your husband's signature on it, a clear, official one." She unfolded the paper and laid it next to a copy of the IOU she had procured from Pike. "Now, I am not a handwriting expert, but you do not need to be one to see the difference." Abigail stared at the two signatures. The one on the marriage license was the confident, flowing script she knew so well. The one on the IOU was similar, but hurried, jagged. There were small, almost imperceptible differences in the way the letters were formed. In the pressure of the pen, it was not the same. "It is a forgery," Abigail whispered, her voice filled with awe. "It is sloppy," Sheriff Collins corrected, "and it is enough to raise serious questions. This is not proof. Not yet. but it is a crack in Silas Pike's foundation. That evening, when Abigail went to the well for her daily chore, the work felt different. The rope did not seem as coarse, the bucket not as heavy. She moved with the slow, steady rhythm Eli had taught her. The whispers still followed her, but they seemed farther away now, less potent. Each bucket she drew from the earth was not just water for washing or cooking. It was a declaration. She was still here. She was earning her keep. She was learning to survive. The well was no longer just a place of labor and gossip. It was the site of her quiet transformation. With every drop she carried, she was building a new foundation, one that could not be washed away by betrayal. Silas Pike had given her 30 days. He thought he was setting a deadline for her defeat. He did not realize he was giving her just enough time to learn how to fight. The days grew hotter, the air thinner. A persistent drought settled over the land, cracking the earth into a mosaic of thirst. The sun was a merciless hammer in a brassy sky, and the wind, once a mere nuisance, became an antagonist. It picked up the topsoil and flung it about in great choking clouds that turned midday into a gritty twilight. Cattle, bones sharp beneath their hides, grew sick from the poor forage and fouled waterholes. The world seemed to be shrinking, closing in under a blanket of dust and despair. In her small room at the widow's boarding house, Abigail felt the oppression of the world outside mirrored in her own heart. Her meager earnings from the post office were barely enough to keep her afloat. More than once, she found herself opening the wooden chest and lifting out the wedding veil. The tool felt like a whisper of a forgotten language against her rough fingers. It was the last tangible piece of her old life, a life of foolish, trusting love. Selling it could provide a small cushion, a few weeks of security. But the thought felt like a final surrender, an admission that the hope it once represented was well and truly dead. She would fold it carefully away each time. The debate between pride and survival, a silent, bitter war waged within her. Silas Pike was not a patient man. He saw Abigail's quiet persistence not as a sign of strength, but as an insult. He dispatched 2 of his ranch hands, a lanky, slow-witted man named Hank, and his sneering, rat-faced partner, Jory, to apply a different kind of pressure. They waited until the postmaster had stepped out for his lunch, with practiced vandalism. They upended a pot of ink across a stack of outgoing mail and accidentally knocked over a shelf of sorted parcels, creating a chaos of paper and string. When the postmaster returned, his face went pale with fury. He looked at the mess, then at Abigail, who stood frozen in dismay. It was her word against 2 of Pike's men, who swore they had seen her trip and cause the whole disaster. The postmaster, a man who valued order above all else, did not officially fire her, but his trust was broken. He cut her hours, his disappointment a constant, silent reprimand. The job, once her refuge, now felt like a cage. The corruption was not confined to Pike's personal vendettas. It was woven into the fabric of Dusty Spur. The small, independent ranchers, men like Eli Boone, who owned a few dozen head of cattle, were being squeezed. The stockyard, owned by a consortium of which Pike was a silent partner, worked in concert with the slaughterhouse to set prices so low they were ruinous. Any rancher who protested, who tried to find another market, would mysteriously lose his access to the North Fork watering hole, the only reliable water source for miles. Their cattle would thirst, and the ranchers would be forced to sell at the fixed price or face ruin. It was a quiet, suffocating kind of warfare. The talk of the new railroad spur added another layer of anxiety. Surveyors had been through, driving stakes into the dry ground. Rumors flew like tumbleweeds the railroad would buy up land, but only from those with clear, registered titles. For many who had homesteaded on a handshake and a promise, their claims were a muddle of poorly marked maps and unfiled paperwork. The railroad, that great engine of progress, felt more like a machine designed to grind the little man into dust. One sweltering afternoon, Eli found Abigail sitting on the porch, staring at the lame mare as she grazed listlessly on the parched grass. "This heat is hard on everyone," he said, his voice a low rumble. "There is barely anything for her to eat," Abigail replied, the worry evident in her tone. "There are other kinds of food," he said after a moment. "Things that know how to grow in the dry times. I am riding out to the foothills tomorrow, to the Sandoval family's farm. They grow a type of corn that can live on dew and a prayer. They might be willing to sell some seed. You should come. The ride will do you good." The invitation was unexpected. The thought of leaving the oppressive confines of Dusty Spur, even for a day, was like a cool drink of water. She agreed. They rode out at dawn the next day, the air still holding a touch of night's coolness. Eli rode his steady buckskin, leading the lame mare, while Abigail rode a gentle horse borrowed from the livery. The landscape was stark, but as they climbed into the rocky foothills, it began to change. Patches of stubborn green clung to life in the shadows of the mesas. The Sandoval farm was not a sprawling ranch, but a small, carefully tended piece of land nestled in a canyon. An older man with a face as wrinkled and kind as a dried apple greeted them in a mixture of Spanish and English. Eli spoke to him with a quiet, easy respect. Never condescending, never impatient. They were shown the corn. Its stalks shorter and sturdier than any Abigail had ever seen. Its leaves a pale, silvery green. As Eli negotiated the purchase of a small sack of seed corn, Abigail watched the Sandoval family. She saw the way they worked together, the way water from a small spring was painstakingly channeled to each plant. This was not the brutal dominion over the land she saw in the cattle operations. It was a partnership, a careful and respectful dance with nature. It was a home, built not on grand promises, but on daily acts of care and wisdom. On the ride back, a comfortable silence settled between them. "Thank you for bringing me," Abigail said. Finally, it was peaceful. "They know the land," Eli said simply. "They listen to it. Most folks out here just want to make it shout." As they neared the town, they passed a small group of men sitting by the side of the road, their faces grim. Their tools lay beside them. "Discarded railroad crew," Eli noted. "Looks like they have been laid off." An idea, born of her experience at the post office and the sight of those hopeless faces, began to form in Abigail's mind. That evening, she found Eli by the corral. "Those men," she began. "They have no work, no money. There are others, too. The ranchers who cannot sell their cattle. The hands who have been let go. What if there was a place they could get a hot meal, not charity, but a community kitchen? People could pay what they could, or trade work for food." Eli looked at her, his faded blue eyes thoughtful. He saw not the abandoned wife, but a woman with a keen eye and a compassionate heart. "That is a good idea. Abigail, a very good idea." The next few days were a blur of activity. Reverend Abel offered the use of the small church social hall. Millie, the mercantile owner, gruffly donated a sack of potatoes and some onions, declaring it was bad for business to have men starving in the street. To take a break from the planning, Eli challenged her to a game of horseshoes. Abigail, who had grown up playing in her grandfather's backyard, picked up the heavy iron shoe and gave it a toss. It landed with a satisfying clang, a perfect ringer. Eli's throw was wide. Her second throw was another ringer. Eli stared at the stake, then at her, and a slow, reluctant smile spread across his face. He scratched the back of his neck. "I surrender," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching, "but do not ask for my horse and saddle as your prize." She laughed, a full, unburdened sound. It was a moment of simple, uncomplicated joy, a bright spot in the dusty landscape of her life. The day before the kitchen was set to open, Sheriff Collins sought her out. The lawwoman's face was serious. "All business." "I received a wire from the marshal's office in El Paso," she said without preamble. "They are looking for a man on charges of fraud, related to a high-stakes card game at a casino there." Abigail felt a cold dread creep up her spine. "The description matches your husband, Edwin Hart," the sheriff continued. her eyes holding Abigail's. The marshal believes that when things got too hot for him in Mexico, he might try to double back. He might be foolish enough to think he can come back here. The news hit her like a physical blow. Edwin, coming back, the man who had betrayed her, who had shattered her world, was not a ghost from her past anymore. He was a potential, terrifying reality. She had just begun to build something new, something of her own, and now the architect of her ruin was threatening to return and knock it all down again. The sheriff's warning hung in the air for 2 days, a storm cloud on the horizon that refused to break. Then, on a Sunday morning, the storm arrived. He came not on a horse, but on the morning stagecoach, stepping out into the dust of Dusty Spur as if he were disembarking onto a theater stage. Edwin Hart wore a fine suit, though it was rumpled from travel and stained at the cuffs. His handsome face was thinner, etched with a new anxiety around the eyes, but he still possessed the same easy, charming smile that had once captured Abigail's heart. He carried a silver-tipped walking stick and the unearned swagger of a man who believes his own lies. He strode into the church just as Reverend Abel was beginning his sermon. A collective gasp rippled through the pews. Edwin paused in the aisle, letting his gaze sweep over the congregation before it settled on Abigail. He walked toward her, his expression a carefully crafted mask of remorse and adoration. "Abigail, my love," he said, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "I have come back for you. I have made terrible mistakes. I know, but everything I did for us. I have secured a partnership with the railroad, a grand opportunity that will make us wealthy beyond our dreams. All is forgiven. We can finally begin our life together." He reached for her hand. The entire town was watching, their faces a mixture of pity, curiosity, and suspicion. Abigail felt the world shrink to the space between them. A part of her, the old, foolish part, wanted to believe him. It would be so easy to let him smooth everything over, to let this nightmare end. She could feel the weight of expectation from the pews, the unspoken pressure to play the role of the forgiving wife. Then she felt another presence. Eli Boone was standing near the back wall, his arms crossed over his chest. He was not looking at Edwin. He was looking at her. His gaze was steady, calm, and asked nothing of her. It simply was. It was a silent testament to her own strength, a reminder that she did not have to be the woman who had first arrived in this town. Abigail pulled her hand back. She rose from the pew, her legs trembling but her voice clear and strong. "No, Edwin," she said, the words tasting strange and powerful on her tongue. "There is nothing for us here." "Darling, do not be this way," he said, his smile tightening. "I know you are angry, but we must retrieve our things, our chest, and leave this dreadful place." "The chest is mine," she said, her voice gaining volume. "The things inside are mine. They were bought with my money, not yours." "You have no claim to them." His face hardened, the charming facade cracking. "That chest contains important documents for my railroad deal, our future. You would not stand in the way of that, would you? The future you speak of was built on lies," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction she did not know she possessed. "You sold my trust. You tried to sell my belongings. I am no longer the person you can sell. Edwin." A stunned silence filled the church. Edwin, for the first time, seemed at a loss for words. Reverend Abel stepped forward, his gentle face firm. "I believe this is a private matter, best discussed elsewhere." Edwin, realizing he had lost his audience, shot Abigail a look of pure venom before turning and stalking out of the church. The community buzzed with whispers, but they were different now. They were not whispers of pity for the abandoned wife, but of respect for the woman who had stood her ground. Later that afternoon, in the smoky back room of Pike's Saloon, a new alliance was forged in mutual desperation. Edwin Hart, his fine suit smelling of dust and failure, sat across from Silas Pike. "She will not give it up," Edwin said, his voice a low hiss. "The chest, it has the original land deeds inside, the ones from before the territory was properly surveyed. They are worth a fortune with the railroad coming through." Pike leaned back, his chair groaning in protest. "And why should I help you? You left me with a worthless IOU and a woman who has become a town project." "Because if I get those deeds, I will cut you in," Edwin said, his eyes gleaming. "A full partnership on the North Fork parcel. You will control the water and the land the new depot will be built on." Greed warred with suspicion on Pike's face. "How do I know you will not just run again?" "Because I have nowhere left to run," Edwin admitted, the words tasting like ash. "And because without your help, she will win. That cowboy and the sheriff are on her side." Pike considered this. The forged IOU was a weakness, but with the original deeds in his possession, he could crush Abigail and all the small ranchers in one fell swoop. He stuck out a fleshy hand. "We have a deal. You get the chest. I will handle the rest." The rest, it turned out, involved escalating the pressure. 2 new men appeared in town. They were hard-faced and wore bowler hats and city clothes that looked out of place in the dust. They claimed to be Pinkerton agents hired by the railroad to protect its interests, but they moved with the swagger of hired thugs. They loitered outside the post office, their stares following Abigail. They asked pointed questions around town, implying that she was a woman of loose morals who had driven her husband away. The tension in Dusty Spur became a palpable thing, thick and suffocating as the summer heat. Sheriff Collins, seeing the situation spiraling, made a decision. She rode out to the county seat and presented her evidence, the conflicting signatures, the reports of intimidation to the district judge. The judge, a stern man named Harlan Pierce, listened intently. He set a date for a formal hearing in 10 days' time. The matter of the IOU and the ownership of Abigail's property would be settled in a court of law. The news was both a relief and a terror. The fight was no longer a personal battle of wills. It was a legal proceeding, with rules she did not understand and an outcome that was far from certain. The weight of it all pressed down on her, leaving her sleepless and frayed. One evening, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Eli Boone appeared at the boarding house. "The sky is putting on a show tonight," he said. "It is best seen from Blue Mesa. Come on, I will bring the mare." They rode out of town, leaving the whispers and the tension behind them. The air grew cooler as they climbed the winding trail up the side of the mesa. From the top, the world spread out below them. A vast, painted desert bathed in the golden light of dusk. The beauty of it was so profound, so immense. It silenced the frantic monologue in Abigail's mind. They sat on a flat rock, watching the colors deepen, after a long, comfortable silence. Eli retrieved a small, heavy object wrapped in an oilcloth from his saddlebag. He unwrapped it to reveal a Colt peacemaker, its metalwork gleaming in the fading light. "I want to teach you something," he said, his voice quiet. He was not looking at her, but at the pistol resting in his palm. "This is a tool, nothing more. It is not brave or cowardly. It is just a piece of steel. The important part is the person holding it." He showed her how to hold it, how to check if it was loaded, how to aim. His hands were gentle as he adjusted her grip. He set up a rusty can on a rock about 20 paces away. "This is not about being fast," he said. "It is about being calm. Take a breath. Let it out slow. Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it. Surprise yourself." The first shot was jarring. The noise was immense, the recoil stronger than she expected. The bullet kicked up dust a yard to the left of the can. "Again," he said, his voice steady. She tried again, focusing on his words. "Breathe in, breathe out. Squeeze." This time, the bullet struck the rock just below the can. She tried a third time, and a fourth. On the 5th shot, she hit it. The can jumped into the air with a satisfying ping and landed in the dust. A slow smile spread across her face. It was not a feeling of power, but of competence, of control. In a life that had spun so wildly out of her grasp, this was a small, solid thing she could master. "Good," Eli said. Nodding, The point is not to go looking for trouble. The point is to know you can face it if it finds you. They sat and watched the last of the light fade, the first stars appearing in the deep velvet of the sky. The tension in Abigail's shoulders had eased. The fear was still there, but it no longer consumed her. That night, back in her room, she opened her wooden chest. She looked at the linens, the silver, the books. She touched the delicate tulle of the wedding veil. They were no longer just memories of a past she had lost. They were hers. The chest was not a coffin for her old dreams anymore. It was an anchor. It was the physical proof of her identity, the evidence of who she was and what had been stolen from her. It was the symbol of her honor, and she would not let it go without a fight. The 10 days leading up to the hearing were not a time of idle waiting. For Abigail, they were a period of profound and rapid transformation. The fear was still a cold stone in her stomach, but she learned to build her life around it. She found that work, hard and purposeful work, was the best antidote to dread. She began spending less time at the post office, where the postmaster's suspicion was a constant chill, and more time with Eli. He did not offer easy comforts or false promises. He offered knowledge. He taught her how to mend a split saddle seam with an awl and waxed thread, her stitches clumsy at first, then growing more even and strong. He showed her how to heat a horseshoe in the forge until it glowed a cherry red, how to shape it on the anvil with firm, deliberate blows, and how to rasp a hoof flat. She was not a blacksmith, but she learned the feel of the tools, the smell of hot iron and scorched hoof, and the satisfaction of seeing a horse stand firm and balanced on her work. Using the drought-resistant corn they had acquired from the Sandoval family, she began baking. In the boarding house's small, hot kitchen, she ground the tough kernels into a coarse meal. After several dense, crumbly failures, she perfected a recipe for cornbread, moist and savory, baked in a cast-iron skillet until the crust was a deep, golden brown. She sold the small loaves to the hay cutters and ranch hands, men with big appetites and little time for cooking. The coins she earned were few, but they were entirely her own, a small cache of capital that represented not a man's betrayal, but her own resilience. The community kitchen was her greatest success. It became known simply as the Ever Warm, a place of refuge in the harsh town. The railroad crew, laid off and forgotten by their employer, was hit by a wave of fever. They had been living in a squalid camp with poor water, and their health failed them. It was Abigail's kitchen that saved them. She organized a rotating schedule of volunteers to cook great pots of nourishing broth and stew. She insisted on cleanliness, on boiling every drop of water. The town, which had once whispered about her, now saw her in a new light. They saw a woman who, despite her own troubles, had created a place of warmth and sustenance for the most vulnerable among them. Millie from the mercantile donated supplies without being asked, and Reverend Abel declared her work a living sermon. Abigail had stopped being the abandoned wife. She had become a vital part of Dusty Spur's heart. This shift in public opinion did not go unnoticed by Silas Pike. Her growing acceptance in the community was a direct challenge to his authority. With the hearing approaching, he made a move to remind everyone who truly held power. He rode out to the North Fork watering hole, the lifeline for all the small ranchers, and chained a heavy log across the access point, securing it with a massive padlock. He posted a sign declaring the water private property, accessible only to ranchers with a signed contract with his stockyard. The news spread like a grass fire. Within a day, the cattle began to suffer. Herds of thirsty animals milled near the locked gate, their lowing a constant, mournful sound. They became gaunt and listless, their eyes dull with thirst. It was a cruel, calculated act, designed to break the spirit of the independent cowboys before they even set foot in the courtroom. That night, a group of them gathered in the livery, their faces grim in the lantern light. Eli Boone was there, his quiet presence a center of gravity. There was talk of cutting the chain, of a direct confrontation. "That is what he wants," Eli said, his voice cutting through the angry murmurs. He wants us to look like thieves and vandals in front of Judge Pierce. So we just let our animals die, one of the ranchers demanded. No, Eli said. We do not let them die, and we do not steal. An hour before dawn, a dozen riders moved out of town as silent as ghosts. They carried no weapons, only bolt cutters and their own quiet resolve. At the North Fork, they cut the chain and swung the heavy log aside. The thirsty cattle surged forward, drinking deeply from the troughs. The cowboys let them drink their fill. Then, before they left, Eli Boone took a small leather pouch from his saddlebag. He counted out a handful of coins, the standard price for watering a herd, and placed them carefully on top of a fence post, weighing them down with a small rock. They had not stolen the water. They had paid for it. They had broken Pike's lock, but not the unwritten laws of decency and fairness that governed their world. It was a simple, powerful statement. The next evening, Abigail was cleaning up at the Ever-Warm, her arms aching with a good weariness. Eli appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands. He looked uncharacteristically hesitant. I made something for you, he said, avoiding her eyes. He held out a pair of work gloves. They were made of soft, supple deerskin, and the stitching, though a little uneven in places, was strong and tight. I saw your hands were still getting torn up, even with the calluses. I thought these might help. She took them, her fingers tracing the seams. The leather was still warm from his hands. It was the most thoughtful gift she had ever received. It was a gift that saw her not as a delicate lady, but as the strong, capable woman she was becoming. It was a gift that acknowledged her work, her pain, and her perseverance. Thank you, Eli, she said, her voice soft. They are beautiful. I am not much of a seamstress, he mumbled, a faint blush rising on his weathered cheeks. They are perfect. She looked up at him, a playful light in her eyes. But you must stop calling me ma'am. He looked flustered, caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone. Ma'am, it makes me feel like my own grandmother, she teased gently. I just did not want to be improper, he stammered, looking so earnest and clumsy that she had to smile. It was a moment of shared, easy humor that felt more intimate than any flowery compliment. The most crucial development came from the most unlikely source. A young boy named Tommy, an orphan whose only regular meals came from the Ever-Warm, had taken to following Abigail around like a devoted puppy. He was a creature of the town's alleys and shadows, seeing and hearing things no one else did. One evening, he slipped into the kitchen, his face pale with excitement, clutching a large, leather-bound book to his chest. I got this for you, Miss Abigail, he whispered, thrusting it into her hands. From the slaughterhouse office. I was hiding in the rafters. I heard Mr. Pike talking to your husband. They were yelling about numbers and deeds. It was the slaughterhouse ledger. Abigail opened it, her hands trembling. The pages were a neat, cold record of transactions, but tucked into the back, on pages that were not meant for public viewing, was a different kind of accounting. She saw Edwin's name, again and again. There were entries detailing payments made to him, disguised as cattle sales, that corresponded to dates when small ranchers had been forced to sell their herds at impossibly low prices. It was all there, in black and white, a clear, damning record of the conspiracy. It was the proof Sheriff Collins needed, the weapon that could finally bring Silas Pike's corrupt empire down. Abigail looked down at the ledger, then at the dirt-smudged, hopeful face of the young boy who had risked so much for her. She thought of the sick men she had fed, of the thirsty cattle at the North Fork, of the small, steady flame of justice that men like Eli Boone kept alive in their hearts. Justice, she realized, was not a thunderclap from on high. It was not a grand, dramatic event. Justice was not loud. It was persistent, like a person carrying water, day after day. It was built from small acts of courage, kindness, and defiance, and for the first time, she truly believed it might be enough. The drought did not break, it tightened its grip. The air grew so dry it felt sharp in the lungs, and a strange, electric tension gathered in the atmosphere. The sky, once a clear and endless blue, turned a hazy, bruised purple at the edges. One evening, with the sun setting in a blaze of angry red, the storm finally came. But it brought no rain. It was a storm of pure energy, a dry tempest that threw jagged spears of lightning from the clouds to the parched earth. A single bolt, silent and brilliant, struck a rise of land a few miles west of town. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a small orange flower bloomed against the twilight, a single spot of incandescence. Fed by the wind and the tinder dry grass, the flower grew with terrifying speed, spreading into a fan, then a line, then a roaring, incandescent wall of fire that began to sweep across the prairie, directly toward Dusty Spur. The church bell began to toll, not the steady call to worship, but a frantic, clanging alarm that spoke of imminent disaster. Doors flew open and people spilled into the main street, their faces pale and fearful in the flickering, distant light. The fire was a living thing on the horizon, a monstrous, hungry beast consuming the dark. There was no formal command, only a shared, instinctual understanding. Men ran for shovels and axes. Women, Abigail among them, rushed to the town well, forming a frantic bucket brigade. They soaked burlap sacks from Millie's mercantile. Anything that could be used to beat back the flames. The entire town, a disparate collection of souls once held together by little more than geography, now moved as one body, driven by the primal urge to save their home. They met the fire at the edge of the grazing lands. The heat was a physical blow, a solid wall that drove the air from their lungs. The roar was a deafening, constant thunder, punctuated by the crackle and pop of burning sage and creosote. Abigail worked in a line with Millie and the Reverend's wife, her face blackened with soot, her eyes streaming from the smoke. They would swing their wet, heavy sacks at the base of the flames, trying to smother the advance. For every foot of fire they extinguished, the beast seemed to leap forward 3. It was a hopeless, desperate battle. Through the smoke and chaos, Eli Boone emerged. He was not panicked. His face was grim, but his movements were calm and deliberate. He assessed the wind, the speed of the flames, the lay of the land. The townspeople were fighting with courage, but without a strategy. "This will not work," he yelled over the din. "We have to burn it out. We need a backfire." A few of the men looked at him as if he were mad. Fight fire by setting another one, but the other independent ranchers, the men who understood the unforgiving logic of the prairie, nodded in agreement. They recognized the authority in Eli's voice, the authority that came not from wealth or title, but from knowledge. He organized them quickly, his commands sharp and clear. They needed to fall back, to find a defensible line, a natural break in the terrain or a wide cattle trail. As he directed the men, the wind, a fickle and cruel ally of the flames, shifted. A collective groan went through the crowd. The main thrust of the fire was now aimed directly at the largest and most prosperous ranch in the area, Silas Pike's. His barns, his corrals, and hundreds of his cattle were directly in the path of the inferno. A hard silence fell over the small group of cowboys gathered around Eli. One of them spat into the dust. "Let it burn," he said, his voice low and bitter. "It is no more than he deserves." A murmur of agreement went through the others. Why should they risk their lives to save the man who was actively trying to ruin them, Abigail, who had come over to bring them water, heard the exchange? She looked at Eli and saw the conflict in his eyes. She stepped forward, her voice clear and steady despite the roar of the approaching flames. "We are not saving it for him," she said, looking from one hard face to the next. "We are saving it for Dusty Spur. A fire does not care whose name is on a deed. If his ranch goes, the whole valley could go next. A home is a place where we choose not to be petty." Her words cut through the anger and resentment. She was right. This was bigger than one man's greed. It was about the survival of them all. Eli looked at her, a flicker of something deep and appreciative in his eyes. He gave a sharp nod. She is right. We make our stand here. The work of setting the backfire was terrifying. They used torches made of oil-soaked rags to set a new line of fire, one that would burn toward the oncoming blaze. For a few heart-stopping minutes, it seemed they had only created a second monster, trapping themselves between two walls of flame. But Eli's calculations were true. The backfire, drawn by the same winds that fed the main conflagration, created a blackened, burned-out strip of land. When the main fire front reached this barrier, it found nothing left to consume. It flared up in a final, furious roar of frustration. And then, slowly, it began to die. In the smoky, hellish light, a new crisis emerged. A shout went up from near one of Pike's outlying sheds. A figure was seen stumbling near the structure, silhouetted against the flames, disoriented by the smoke. "It is Hart," someone yelled. "Edwin Hart." Abigail's heart froze. She saw him, a pathetic, reeling figure, trapped between the dying fire and the smoldering backburn. He was clearly drunk, having sought refuge in the shed with a bottle, only to be caught in the disaster. Before anyone could react, Eli was moving. He pulled his neckerchief up over his nose and mouth and ran into the choking smoke. He moved with a speed and purpose she had never seen, disappearing into the swirling gray haze. A few moments later, he emerged, half carrying, half dragging Edwin, whose legs had given out completely. Eli did not stop. He hoisted Edwin's limp form over his shoulder in a fireman's carry and strode away from the main group, away from where Abigail stood watching, paralyzed. He took Edwin toward the far side of the field, where the sheriff was organizing a wagon for the injured, deliberately sparing Abigail the shame and the pain of a close-up encounter with her husband in his drunken, pathetic state. It was a small act, almost lost in the grand drama of the night. But to Abigail, it was everything. It was an act of profound and quiet kindness. As dawn broke, the fire was out. The sun rose on a changed world. A vast black scar stretched across the prairie, still smoking in places. The air was thick with the smell of ash and defeat. The people of Dusty Spur were slumped in exhaustion, their faces and clothes covered in a uniform layer of gray soot. In the pale morning light, there was no difference between the shopkeeper and the cowboy, the preacher and the sinner. They were all just survivors, bound together by the ash of their shared ordeal. The adrenaline of the long night faded, and a deep, trembling exhaustion took its place. Back at the boarding house, Abigail sat on the porch steps, shivering in the cool morning air. The world was eerily silent, the only sound a faint, whispery rustle as fine gray ash continued to drift down from the sky like a mournful snow. She did not hear Eli approach. He simply appeared beside her and draped a heavy wool blanket over her shoulders. He sat down on the step next to her, not too close, but near enough that she could feel the weary warmth of him. He said nothing. There were no words for a night like that. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the ash fall, watching the blackened world emerge in the growing light. Her hand lay on the step between them, clenched into a fist, gently. He reached out and covered her hand with his own. His palm was calloused and warm, and the simple, solid pressure of it seemed to ground her, to pull her back from the edge of her own exhaustion. It was not a gesture of romance, but of shared humanity, a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had just endured together, a moment of pure, unspoken connection. Their peace was broken by the sound of a horse being ridden hard into town. It was one of the other ranchers. He reined in before the boarding house, his face a mask of fury. "It is Pike," he said, his voice raw. "He is down at the saloon, telling everyone who will listen that we set the fire. He is saying we are a gang of arsonists who tried to burn him out. He is twisting the whole thing, turning it into a weapon to use against us at the hearing." Eli slowly removed his hand from Abigail's and stood up. His face was a hard, unreadable mask. but she could see the cold fire burning in his eyes. Just then, Sheriff Collins walked up, her face as tired as everyone else's, but her eyes sharp. She held a piece of paper in her hand. "I think, mister, Pike is about to have bigger problems than spinning yarns. She said—" She held out the paper. It was the land contract Pike had been waving around, the one supposedly solidifying his partnership with the railroad. "I was looking at this last night before the fire," the sheriff said. "Something about it bothered me. I finally figured it out." She pointed to an embossed seal at the bottom of the page. "The railroad's official corporate seal has an eagle with 13 arrows in its talon. This one," she said, her voice grim with satisfaction, "only has 12. It was a forgery, a clumsy, arrogant one. Another of Silas Pike's lies, about to be brought into the light." The night after the fire was a world of black and gray, a landscape of ghosts. The makeshift camp for the firefighters was a small circle of light and life carved out of the immense, silent darkness of the burned prairie. It consisted of a few wagons, a cook fire, and a handful of tents made from cowhide stretched over cottonwood frames. The wind, having done its destructive work, now moaned across the blackened earth. A lonely, keening sound that slipped through the smallest cracks and chilled a person to the bone. Inside one of the tents, a single oil lamp cast a warm, golden glow. The light flickered and danced, a fragile but defiant beacon against the vast, windy dark. Abigail sat on a bedroll, a heavy wool blanket draped over her shoulders. She had tried to sleep, but her mind would not rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the wall of fire, felt its ravenous heat, heard its terrifying roar. The adrenaline that had fueled her through the long night had ebbed away, leaving behind a deep, cellular exhaustion that made her very bones ache. A tremor started in her hands and spread through her body, a violent shiver that had little to do with the cold. It was the body's final admission of defeat after a battle that had taken everything. The tent flap opened, and Eli Boone entered, bringing with him a gust of wind and the sharp smell of ash. He moved with a quiet economy that seemed to absorb the restless energy of the world outside. He saw her shivering, the uncontrollable quaking of her frame, and his face, already etched with weariness, softened with concern. He said nothing, but knelt in front of her. He gently took her hands in his. They were like ice, stiff and unresponsive. He began to chafe them between his own large, calloused palms, his movement slow and steady, his touch creating a friction that was less about heat and more about a simple, human connection. "The cold gets in you after a fire," he said, his voice a low, soothing rumble. "Even on a warm night, the body remembers the heat and forgets how to make its own." She could only nod, her teeth chattering. He continued to warm her hands, his gaze fixed on the task. He was a man of action, not words, and in this simple, physical act of care, he was more eloquent than any poet. He pulled the deerskin gloves he had made for her from his pocket. They were smudged with soot, but the leather was soft. Carefully, he worked them onto her hands, his fingers gently guiding hers into the warm, supple deerskin. Still, she shivered. He stood up, and without a moment's hesitation, he unbuttoned his heavy duster, the canvas coat that was his shield against the elements. It smelled of leather, dust, and wood smoke, the scent of the man himself. He draped it over her shoulders, over the blanket, its considerable weight a comforting, grounding presence. It was an act of pure, uncomplicated protection, as natural to him as breathing. The weight and the warmth began to work their magic. The violent shivering subsided into a gentle trembling. He sat down on a crate across from her, leaving a respectful distance between them, and watched the flame of the lamp. The light caught the sharp planes of his face, revealing the deep lines of fatigue around his eyes. He looked as tired as she felt. "Thank you," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. He just nodded, his eyes still on the flame. in the quiet, warm space of the tent, with the wind crying outside. The barriers Abigail had so carefully constructed around her heart began to dissolve. The long, lonely weeks, the fear, the humiliation, the small victories and the crushing setbacks, it all seemed to rise up inside her, a great, silent wave of emotion. "When I first came here," she began, her voice gaining a little strength, "I thought I knew what a home was. I thought it was 4 walls and a roof, a piece of land with a deed. I thought it was a promise made by a man. I thought I had lost it all at the station platform that first day." She looked down at her gloved hands, turning them over and over. "I was so ashamed, so afraid. Every whisper in town felt like a blow. Every day was just survival." She looked up at him then, her eyes swimming with tears that did not fall. "I was left penniless after my husband's betrayal." She took a ragged breath, the words catching in her throat as she gave voice to the truth that had defined her existence for so long. She saw a flicker of pain in his eyes. Not pity, but a deep, shared empathy. "And then," she continued, her voice growing thick with unshed tears, "you, the lone cowboy, you taught me the true meaning of home." The words hung in the air between them, simple, direct, and profoundly true. She had finally spoken the title of her own story, the core of her transformation. Eli was silent for a long time. He looked away from the lamp and met her gaze. His sun-faded eyes were clear and steady, and in their depths, she saw a profound and solemn stillness. "A home is not a roof over your head," he said, his voice soft, but with the weight of a deep conviction. "It is not something you can buy or sell. Home is the place where you are called by your name, not by your debt." His words landed in her heart with the force of a revelation. That was it. That was the truth she had been slowly, painfully discovering. Silas Pike and Edwin Hart had tried to define her by what she owed, by her status as a debtor, an abandoned wife. Eli had only ever seen her, Abigail, a person worthy of respect and kindness, a person with a name. A tear finally escaped and traced a clean path through the soot on her cheek. It was followed by another. A small, watery laugh escaped her lips. "These gloves," she said, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground, lifting her hand to look at them. "They are the kindest gift I have ever received." A faint, sheepish smile touched his lips. "Well, I did tell you I was not much of a seamstress." He gestured to her right hand. "I think I made the little finger on that one a bit too long." She looked down, and he was right. The deerskin on the smallest finger was noticeably longer than the others. A small, endearing imperfection. She laughed again, a sound that was half sob, half pure delight. She looked at him through her tears, her heart feeling so full it might burst. "It fits," she said, her voice thick but clear. "It fits the size of your kindness." The moment stretched, warm and intimate. The wind outside seemed to fade, and the world shrank to the small, golden space within the tent. The oil lamp flame danced and swayed. A tiny, resilient heart of light in the vast darkness, a perfect mirror of the hope he had kindled in her. This tent, this temporary shelter made of hide and wood, felt more like a home than any house she had ever known. He cleared his throat, as if the intensity of the moment was too much. "The hearing is in a few days," he said, his voice returning to its practical, steady tone. "Pike will have twisted the story of this fire to his advantage by then. Edwin will likely testify against you. It will not be easy." "I know," she said, the familiar cold stone of fear settling back in her stomach. "I want you to know," he said, leaning forward slightly, his expression earnest, his gaze unwavering, "that whatever happens in that courtroom, whether you win or lose, I will be standing right there, and I will be here when it is over." He paused, choosing his next words with great care. "This is your fight, Abigail. You have earned the right to fight it your own way. I will not get in your way, but I will not let you stand alone." It was not a declaration of love, not a hasty proposal born of a dramatic night. It was something more profound, It was a promise of unwavering loyalty. It was a testament to his respect for her strength, for her autonomy. He was not offering to save her. He was offering to stand with her, as an equal, a partner in the struggle. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She reached out and rested her hand on his arm. It was a simple, chaste gesture, a touch that conveyed all the gratitude and trust she could not express in words. He covered her hand with his own, and they sat like that for a long time, two weary souls finding a moment of peace before the final storm. Outside, the wind howled its lonely song over the blackened prairie, but inside the small tent, the lamp burned steady and bright. The county courthouse was not a grand hall of justice. It was a simple, boxy wooden building that baked in the New Mexico sun, smelling perpetually of dry rot, old paper, and stale sweat. On the day of the hearing, it was filled to capacity. The entire population of Dusty Spur seemed to be crammed onto the hard wooden benches, fanning themselves with their hats and folded handbills. Motes of red dust danced in the thick shafts of sunlight that slanted through the tall, dirty windows. A pair of ceiling fans turned with a slow, rhythmic creak, doing little more than stir the hot, heavy air. At the front of the room, on a raised platform, sat Judge Harlan Pierce. He was a man who seemed to have been carved from granite, with a stern, unyielding face and eyes that saw through bluster and falsehood. He surveyed the crowded room with an expression of profound impatience, as if he had 1,000 better things to do than listen to the petty squabbles of a dusty frontier town. Abigail sat at a small table to the left, with Sheriff May Collins beside her. Eli Boone stood against the back wall, his face impassive, his presence a silent, solid anchor in the churning sea of her anxiety. Across the room sat Silas Pike, looking smug and confident next to a slick, well-dressed lawyer he had brought in from the county seat, and a few feet away, looking pale and shifty in his rumpled suit, was Edwin Hart. Pike's lawyer began, his voice smooth and condescending. He painted a simple picture of a straightforward business debt. An IOU, he argued, was a sacred contract in the West. He held up the document for the judge to see. He spoke of Edwin Hart's ambitious plans that would have benefited the whole community, and of the loving wife who had supported him. The simple, unassailable fact, Your Honor, the lawyer concluded, turning his gaze on Abigail, is that a wife is party to her husband's fortunes and to his debts. It is the bedrock of a stable society. Mrs. Hart enjoyed the benefits of her husband's standing. She must now honor his obligations. He then called Edwin to the stand. Edwin walked with a practiced, confident stride, but his eyes darted nervously around the room. He spoke of his grand railroad deal, his voice filled with a false heartiness that rang hollow in the quiet courtroom. He claimed the money from Pike was a short-term loan to secure land options, a venture Abigail had fully supported. "And this chest she is so protective of," the lawyer asked, "what is its significance?" "It contains our future," Edwin said, looking at Abigail with an expression of wounded sincerity. "Vital documents, deeds, contracts for the railroad. Her refusal to relinquish it is puzzling and deeply damaging to our shared enterprise." Judge Pierce leaned forward, his voice a low growl. "Mr. Hart, are you currently employed by the railroad in any official capacity?" "I am a partner in a development venture," Edwin said evasively. "That was not the question," the judge said, his voice like stones grinding together. "Are you on their payroll? Do you have a letter of engagement?" "It is a more informal arrangement at present," Edwin stammered. The first cracks were appearing in his composure. When it was Sheriff Collins's turn, she did not begin with questions. She began with evidence. She walked to the judge's bench and laid out 3 documents: the IOU, a copy of Abigail and Edwin's marriage license, and a page from the church donation registry from 2 years prior, which Reverend Abel had provided. "Your Honor," the sheriff said, her voice crisp and clear, "I would draw your attention to the signature of Edwin Hart on these 3 documents. The signature on the license and the one on the church registry, provided a year apart, are identical in form and pressure. The signature on this IOU, while similar, shows marked differences. A notable hesitation in the upswing of the H, a cramped and hurried quality to the final T. It is, at best, a signature made under duress, and at worst, a clumsy forgery. Pike's lawyer jumped to his feet, objecting, but the judge silenced him with a wave of his hand. His eyes narrowed as he studied the papers. Next, Sheriff Collins produced the contract Pike had been showing around town, the one detailing his supposed partnership with the railroad. And this, Your Honor, is the document Mr. Pike has been using to legitimize his land grabs. I would ask you to examine the corporate seal. She handed the judge a magnifying glass. I have a telegram here from the railroad's head office. Their seal, used on all official documents, depicts an eagle clutching 13 arrows. The seal on this document, as you can see, shows only 12. A low murmur went through the courtroom. Silas Pike's face had lost its smugness, replaced by a mottled, purplish rage. Finally, the sheriff brought out the slaughterhouse ledger. This was brought to me by a concerned citizen, she said, her eyes briefly meeting the proud, terrified gaze of young Tommy in the crowd. It is the private ledger of the slaughterhouse, of which Mr. Pike is the primary owner. It details a series of payments made to Mr. Hart. These payments, disguised as stock purchases, coincide perfectly with the dates that several independent ranchers, she gestured to the grim-faced men in the audience, were forced to sell their herds to Mr. Pike at a fraction of their value. The ledger was a map of Pike's greed, a detailed account of the conspiracy that had been strangling the life out of Dusty Spur. When Abigail was called to the stand, a hush fell over the room. She walked steadily, her hands clenched at her sides. She sat down and looked directly at Judge Pierce, her gaze calm and clear. She did not speak of legalities or evidence. She simply told her story. She spoke of the letters filled with promises, of her journey west with a heart full of hope. She described her arrival, the crushing discovery of her husband's betrayal, and the moment Silas Pike had presented her with a debt she did not incur and a demand that she work it off in his camp. She told the court about hauling water, about the blisters that had formed and broken on her hands. She spoke of learning to bake cornbread, of selling it for a few pennies to feel the dignity of her own labor. She spoke of the ever-warm kitchen, of the sick railroad men, of the simple human need to offer a plate of hot food to someone in need. Her voice did not tremble. It was the voice of a woman who had been tested by fire and had not burned. Mr. Pike's lawyer says a wife must honor her husband's debts, she said, her voice ringing with a quiet, unshakable conviction. I was prepared to do that, but this was not about money. This was about ownership. Mr. Pike did not want repayment. He wanted me. He believed that because my husband had abandoned me, I had become a piece of property to be claimed, a debt to be collected in servitude. She took a deep breath. The law is meant to protect us. Your Honor, it cannot be used as an excuse to make one person the property of another. Pike's lawyer, desperate now, rose to cross-examine. He tried to portray her as a vindictive woman, a liar. He brought up the fire, implying that the independent ranchers were a lawless gang. And is it not true, Mrs. Hart, he sneered, that these cowboy friends of yours recently trespassed on my client's property, breaking a lock and stealing his water? Before Abigail could answer, Eli Boone's voice came from the back of the room. I can speak to that, Your Honor. Judge Pierce looked at him, a flicker of interest in his stern eyes. Approach the bench, Mr. Boone. Eli walked to the front of the courtroom, his spurs making a soft, rhythmic jingle on the wooden floor. He stood before the judge, a plain-spoken man in a room full of liars and schemers. He calmly recounted the events at the North Fork. He described the suffering cattle, the decision to cut the chain, and the reason for it. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He opened it and poured a handful of coins onto the railing of the witness stand. "This is the money we left, Your Honor," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "We paid for the water we used, at the price he used to charge before he decided to use thirst as a weapon. We are not thieves. We believe in paying our way. That is more than I can say for Mr. Pike, who seeks to take what is not his, or for Mr. Hart, who runs from what he owes." That was the final, decisive blow. The coins on the railing were more powerful than any legal argument. They were proof of character, a testament to a code of honor that Silas Pike and Edwin Hart could never understand. Judge Harlan Pierce looked from the coins to Silas Pike's furious and sweating face, and then to Edwin Hart, who seemed to have shrunk inside his fine suit. The judge's expression was one of profound disgust. He picked up his gavel. "This court has heard enough," he said, his voice like the crack of a whip. The gavel came down with a thunderous bang that echoed the dry lightning of the storm. "The document known as IOU is hereby declared null and void, having been entered into under coercion and with its authenticity in serious doubt." Another bang of the gavel. "This court requests that the sheriff's office open a full criminal investigation into the business practices of one Silas Pike, based on the evidence of fraud and extortion presented here today." Another bang. "And based on a telegraphic warrant from the United States Marshal's office in El Paso, this court orders Edwin Hart to be taken into custody on federal charges of fraud." For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Then, the courtroom erupted. A great spontaneous roar of applause and cheers went up from the benches. Men were on their feet, clapping each other on the back. Silas Pike was shouting, his face a mask of disbelief. As Sheriff Collins moved toward him, Edwin Hart simply collapsed in his chair, his face in his hands, a broken man. The sheriff did not stop at Pike. She walked to his lawyer's table, picked up the key to the saloon, and handed it to one of her deputies. "Seize his safe," she ordered. A few minutes later, the deputy returned, carrying a small iron box. The sheriff opened it on the courtroom floor. Inside, among stacks of cash, was a letter detailing a series of bribe payments to a railroad surveyor. The red dust that had filled the air seemed to settle. The oppressive heat seemed to break. A sense of order, of a great wrong finally being righted, washed over the room. Abigail sat at her table, the sound of the celebration washing over her. She did not feel triumphant, only a deep, profound, and bone-weary sense of relief. Eli came and stood beside her, his hand resting for a moment on her shoulder, a silent, steady presence. As the crowd began to file out into the bright, clean sunlight, Millie from the Mercantile was waiting in the courthouse lobby. She had a large basket over her arm, filled with slabs of fresh, golden cornbread, wrapped in checkered napkins. "What is this?" Millie Reverend Abel asked. Smiling, Millie began handing out the bread to the hungry, victorious townspeople. "Well, Reverend," she said, her voice its usual gruff, practical self, "justice makes a person hungry." In the days that followed the verdict, a profound and unfamiliar quiet settled over Dusty Spur. It was the sound of a fever breaking, the deep collective exhale of a town that had been holding its breath for too long. The oppressive weight of Silas Pike's ambition was gone. He was taken away on the eastbound stage, seated between two grim-faced deputies, his expression not one of remorse, but of sullen, impotent rage. He was a king dethroned, and his absence left a vacuum that was quickly filled by the clean, fresh air of possibility. Edwin's departure was a much quieter affair. Faced with the undeniable evidence of the ledger and the federal warrant, he had crumbled completely. In a quiet, pathetic meeting in Sheriff Collins's office, he signed a full confession, a rambling document that sought to blame everyone but himself. He was put on a train bound for El Paso, a ghost of a man in a rumpled suit, his silver-tipped cane and grand pronouncements a hollow memory. He vanished from Dusty Spur not with a bang, but with the pathetic sigh of a deflating balloon. True to the judge's order, Pike's assets were seized, The saloon was sold, the slaughterhouse put under new, fair management, and the money from his safe, along with the proceeds from the sales, was used to establish a community water fund. In a town meeting held in the now spotless church hall, Sheriff Collins announced that the North Fork watering hole was officially public land, its use to be governed by a newly formed water committee. Furthermore, a system of vouchers was created, ensuring that even the poorest laborers or the families hit hardest by the drought could draw a fair share of water, their dignity intact. It was the beginning of a new social contract for the town, one built not on power and greed, but on shared survival and mutual respect. For Abigail, the verdict was not an ending, but a license to begin. The small community kitchen in the church hall had served its purpose, but it was a temporary measure. She now envisioned something more permanent, a place that was truly hers, with a small loan from the new community fund, secured by the projected income from her cornbread sales. She took over a small, abandoned storefront next to the livery. The place was a wreck, its windows clouded with grime, its floor thick with the dust of years of neglect. But Abigail saw not what it was, but what it could be. She named it the Ever Warm. It was more than a name. It was a promise. She scrubbed the floors on her hands and knees, washed the windows until they sparkled, and patched the leaky roof. She installed a large, efficient wood-burning stove she bought at a discount from the mercantile. Millie, in a rare display of sentiment, threw in a set of sturdy iron pots for free. The Ever Warm was not just a place to eat. It was an institution. The sign in the window, which Abigail painted herself, read good food, fair prices. If your pockets are empty, your credit is good. Work traded for meals. The town watched her transformation with a quiet sense of awe. This was not the frightened, grieving woman who had stepped off the train months ago. This was a businesswoman, a community leader, a woman who had forged a new identity from the ashes of her old life. Her internal compass had shifted. The constant, nagging question of what am I afraid of had been replaced by the clear, declarative statement of what is it that I want. She wanted to build a place of warmth and welcome. She wanted to ensure no one in this town ever felt as alone and hungry as she had. One afternoon, as she was sweeping the last of the dust out of the new kitchen, Eli appeared in the doorway. He was not alone. Behind him stood young Tommy and a half-dozen other children, their faces scrubbed and eager. Eli was carrying a stack of fresh-smelling pine boards. "The mayor needs a proper shelter for the winter," he said by way of explanation, "and I thought the backlot here would be the perfect place, if that is all right with you." "I want that very much," Abigail said, her heart giving a small, happy leap. And so they began to build again. In the dusty lot behind the Ever Warm, they constructed a small, sturdy stable, just big enough for 2 horses. It was a shared project, a silent dance of cooperation. He would saw the boards, and she would hold them steady. He would drive the nails with swift, efficient blows, and she would bring him cool water from the well. They worked in a comfortable, easy silence, their movements synchronized, their purpose shared. While they worked, Eli became an unlikely teacher. He would gather the children who were always underfoot and show them how to work with scraps of leather. He taught them how to braid, how to tool simple patterns, how to fashion a crude but functional strap or a small pouch. His large, calloused hands, so capable of shaping iron or calming a nervous horse, were surprisingly gentle and patient as he guided the small, clumsy fingers of his young pupils. Abigail would watch him from the kitchen doorway, a pot of stew simmering on the stove, and see a side of this quiet, solitary man she had never imagined. She saw a man whose gentleness was as profound as his strength, a man who could build a home not just with wood and nails, but with patience and kindness. One evening, after a long day of work on the stable, Abigail went to her room at the boarding house. She opened the heavy wooden chest, the object that had once been the symbol of her ruin and the focus of the court battle. It was just a box now, filled with things. She reached inside and took out the wedding veil. In the soft light of the lamp, the tool seemed to shimmer, a ghost of a forgotten promise. She did not feel sadness or anger. She felt a sense of peace, of distance. That part of her life was over. She took a pair of sewing scissors from her basket. The snip of the blades as they cut into the delicate fabric was a small, decisive sound. It was not an act of destruction, but of creation. She cut the veil into 2 long, rectangular panels. The next morning, she washed and ironed them, and with small, neat stitches, she hemmed the edges and sewed a channel along the top of each. She hung them in the front window of the ever-warm. 2 simple, elegant curtains that softened the harsh afternoon sun. The light that now filtered into her kitchen, her place of business. Her contribution to the world was diffused through the very fabric of her past. Her old dream had been repurposed to bring light to her new reality. Her new standing in the community was solidified in small, significant ways. Reverend Abel, on behalf of the town council, formally invited her to sit on the new water committee, citing her clear-headedness and her commitment to fairness. A few days later, Sheriff Collins stopped by the kitchen. "The railroad is sending a new crew to start work on the spur next month," the sheriff said. "Getting straight to the point, these men get hurt, a lot. They need someone to teach them the basics of first aid, how to set a splint, how to clean a wound, how to stop bleeding. I told them I knew just the woman for the job." Abigail was stunned. Her, a teacher, a medic. It was a responsibility she had never imagined, but the sheriff's confidence in her was a powerful tonic. She said yes. The final touch for the ever-warm was the sign that would hang over the door. Eli had insisted on making it himself, planning a wide piece of pine until it was smooth as glass. He had a can of black paint and a brush. "Let me help," Abigail offered. "No," he said, a look of intense concentration on his face. "I have got it." She watched, amused, from the doorway as he painstakingly began to letter the sign. He was slow and careful, his tongue sticking out from the corner of his mouth as he formed each letter. When he was finished, he stepped back to admire his work, a proud, satisfied smile on his face. He had painted in slightly wobbly but earnest black letters the ever-warm. Abigail put a hand to her mouth to stifle a laugh. He had added an extra V. He turned to her, his smile faltering as he saw her expression. He looked back at the sign, and his face fell. "Oh, no," he groaned. She came and stood beside him, linking her arm through his. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do not worry," she said, her voice filled with a deep, happy affection. "We will not fix it. Our little kitchen will be famous. It will be known for its warmth and for its charming mistakes." He looked down at her, his blush visible even in the fading light, and a slow, genuine smile returned to his face. In that moment, surrounded by the scent of fresh paint and baking bread, with a promise of a shared future hanging in the air, the healing felt complete. The long, hard season of survival was over. A season of living was about to begin. A rare rain had washed the world clean. It had come in the night, a soft, steady shower that settled the dust and scrubbed the sky to a brilliant, pristine blue. Now, in the late afternoon, the world was cast in a light so pure and golden it seemed to have substance, as if you could hold it in your hand. The air smelled of wet creosote and damp earth, a scent of renewal and life. Out on the prairie, the cacti, awakened by the moisture, had unfurled in a sudden, shocking riot of waxy yellow and pink blossoms. Inside the ever-warm, the kitchen was alive with the scent of melting butter and baking cornbread. Abigail was wiping down the long wooden counter, her movements steady and content. Through the open doorway, she could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of a hammer tapping wood. She stepped outside. Eli was in the small yard, his back to her. He was working on the new gate he had built for the kitchen garden, the one that led to the small, misspelled sign hanging over her door. One of the hinges had been slightly crooked, and he was meticulously resetting it, ensuring it swung smooth and true. He was a man who could not abide a thing that did not work as it should. Beside him, tied loosely to the fence post, was the lame mare, the one he had taken in trade and patiently cared for. The horse's coat was brushed to a deep, healthy shine, and she stood foursquare, her limp so faint it was almost invisible. She looked up as Abigail approached, her dark eyes soft and curious. Eli finished his work, testing the gate one last time. It swung open with a soft, satisfying click. He turned, wiping his hands on his trousers, and saw her watching him. A familiar, shy warmth entered his eyes. "She is for you," he said, his voice quiet, gesturing to the mare. "The stable is finished. I thought you deserved a new beginning, one that is steady on its feet." Abigail's heart swelled. She walked to the mare and stroked the horse's soft nose. The animal was a living, breathing symbol of his quiet, patient kindness, of his belief in rescuing things others had deemed broken. "She is beautiful." "Eli, thank you." He came and stood beside her, not touching her, but his presence was a warmth she could feel all along her side. They stood in the golden light, looking at the small, thriving world they had begun to build: the clean kitchen, the sturdy stable, the little garden patch. "I have been thinking," Eli said, his voice unusually rough. He cleared his throat, but his gaze remained fixed on the distant, blooming mesas. "About what you said. In the tent, about home." Abigail waited, her heart beginning a slow, steady drumbeat. He turned to face her, and she saw the vulnerability in his sun-faded eyes. His hands, usually so steady, were clenched at his sides. "A home." "To me," he said, his voice shaky, but deeply sincere, "is a place where you do not need permission to laugh, a place where you do not have to be afraid to speak your mind, or to be quiet when you need to be. It is a place where you are just seen," he faltered, the words clearly not coming easy to him. "And I find, Abigail, that I feel that way when I am standing next to you." He reached into the pocket of his waistcoat. His hand was trembling now. He did not pull out a velvet box, but a small, simple object that he held out on his calloused palm. It was a ring, a simple band of silver, its surface not perfectly smooth, but faceted from careful, patient filing. It glowed softly in the afternoon light. "I found an old railroad spike out by the burned lands," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The railroad, that whole machine, it is meant to crush things, to run over the land, and the people on it. I wanted to see if I could make something different out of it, something that joins instead of divides." He looked up, and his gaze held hers, unwavering and true. "I am not a rich man, Abigail. I do not have a ranch or a deed to promise you. All I have is my word and my hands, but I will use them to build with you, every day, if you will let me. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, blurring the golden world around them. She looked at the ring, a perfect circle of redemption made from the refuse of a brutal world. She looked at his face, this quiet, honest man, who had never once tried to save her. Instead, he had offered her tools, taught her skills, and stood beside her, letting her save herself. He did not want to own her. He wanted to stand with her. She lifted her hand, and he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "We will build a home, Eli," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion so deep it was almost painful. "Not just a house, a home." He let out a long, shuddering breath, as if he had been holding it for weeks. A slow, brilliant smile transformed his weathered face, a smile of such pure, unadulterated joy that it took her breath away. He gently cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, a chaste, reverent kiss that tasted of salt and sun and the promise of a lifetime. A sudden burst of applause made them spring apart, blushing like school children. Framed in the doorway of the ever-warm was a small, grinning delegation. Sheriff May Collins was there, leaning against the door jamb, her arms crossed. Beside her, Millie was wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron, pretending she had dust in them. Reverend Abel beamed, his kind face alight with happiness, and hiding behind his legs, his face split in a wide grin, was young Tommy. "It is about time. Boone!" Sheriff Collins called out, her voice dry but her eyes sparkling. "Another week and I was going to have to arrest you for loitering with intent." "Does this mean we get free cornbread?" Millie demanded, though her voice was thick. "Come in, all of you," Abigail said, her face flushed and her heart overflowing. She grabbed Eli's hand and pulled him inside their kitchen. The room was filled with laughter and warm, teasing voices. Tommy ran to hug Abigail and Eli in a gesture of pure, natural belonging, rested his hand on the boy's head. Reverend Abel gave them a quiet blessing, and Millie, in a shocking display of generosity, produced a small bottle of brandy she had hidden in her basket for medicinal purposes. The light inside the kitchen was bright and clear, the old smoky oil lamp that Abigail had once kept on the porch, a relic from her first dark nights at the boarding house, was gone. In its place, Eli had hung a new, bright lantern with polished glass panes, a gift from the town council. It caught the setting sun and threw prisms of light across the walls, illuminating the faces of their friends, their community, their family. Later, after the well-wishers had gone, and the last of the buttery cornbread had been eaten, Abigail stood at the front window of the ever-warm. The sky was a deep, velvet purple, and the first stars were appearing, a soft, clean breeze, smelling of the night-blooming flowers, blew through the open window, stirring the simple curtains she had made from her wedding veil. The past no longer had any power over her. It was just fabric, bleached by the sun, dancing in the wind of her new life. Eli came to stand behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his solid chest. She leaned her head back against his shoulder, her hand covering his, the simple silver ring solid against her finger. The kitchen was quiet around them, the only sound the soft, comforting hiss of the kettle on the cooling stove. "Let's go home," Eli whispered, his lips against her hair. She smiled. Closing her eyes, he was not talking about the boarding house or any other building. He was talking about the space they now shared, this place of respect and choice and quiet, disciplined love. In the silence, she heard the soft clink of a spoon against a pot as she settled a lid for the night, the simple, domestic sound of a life truly, finally beginning. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment below and tell us where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and give us your support by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people